Welcome to the Personality Couch podcast, where we discuss all things personality and clinical practice. I'm your host, Doc Bach, and I'm here with my co host, Doc Fish. We are both licensed clinical psychologists in private practice, and today we are transitioning into our Schizotypal personality series. In this episode, we'll define the terms schizoid, schizotypal, and schizophrenia before discussing similarities, differences, and whether or not they should be on the same continuum. In this series, we also explore a fascinating term called schizotypy or schizotypy. We have got a jam-packed episode as usual, so let's dive in.
So first we need to define the terms, starting with how the DSM describes them. And in hearing these definitions, it's important to remember that the DSM is disorder level only. So it's possible to have schizoid or schizotypal personality styles and not have it at a disorder level.
Right. Yeah. So let's just do a quick recap here with schizoid personality disorder and what it means. So, for schizoid personality disorder, there has to be a pattern of social detachment and restricted emotional expression, plus four or more criteria involving not wanting, enjoying, and/or lacking close relationships, lack of interest in sexual experiences, choosing solitary activities, not taking pleasure in things, appearing indifferent to praise or criticism, and showing emotional coldness, detachment, or flattened emotional expressions. And remember, there's no psychosis or autism here.
Now, in the DSM, to meet criteria for schizotypal personality disorder, there has to be a pattern of social and interpersonal deficits marked by acute discomfort with and reduced capacity for close relationships and cognitive or perceptual distortions and eccentricities of behavior. So basically, we're taking some of the overlap from schizoid, but cognitive oddities are also present, making them like on the cusp of reality and non-reality.
Yep. And for this diagnosis, there can be 5 or more of the following. So, first, we have ideas of reference. Ideas of reference are interpretations that benign events are of personal significance. So, let's give a few examples here. So, perhaps Taylor Swift left me a personal Easter egg on her recent album since I'm her biggest fan. Or maybe that news guy on TV is talking to me directly and just me. So these are not full-blown delusions of reference because we're not in psychosis. The second is odd beliefs or magical thinking that influences behavior and is inconsistent with cultural norms. So a few examples here, like extreme superstitiousness, belief in clairvoyance, the paranormal, telepathy, or like a sixth sense. And then in children and adolescents, this can actually look like bizarre fantasies or preoccupations, or possibly even having like magical powers, which can really show up in both kids and adults. But so an example of this might be like an odd belief or magical thinking that Doc Fish wore black today because I thought that she would. So she must have received my thoughts.
Which I didn't, but thank you for sending them. So criterion 3 is unusual perceptual experiences, including bodily illusions. So the perception of the physical body is different from the actual body. So like feeling like someone else is present in the room or not really knowing where your own body is in space. Criterion 4 is odd thinking or speech, which can come out in a lot of different ways. It can be vague and nonspecific, metaphorical, maybe abstract. Conversely, it can be over elaborate and excessive. It could be highly tangential with unusual associations that aren't even linear. So, like, for example, talking about like frogs and then somehow linking that to like elaborate research that you've done on cornflakes.
Yeah. So it's not like incoherent, as in full blown psychosis, but it's just really odd. Like, not how most people talk, but not really outside of reality completely. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So the fifth one is suspiciousness or paranoid ideation. Like, for example, maybe their coworkers are trying to undermine them with the boss. The sixth one is inappropriate or constricted affect. And actually, constricted affect would be more similar to a schizoid here. But these types are not able to negotiate social cues well. And then seventh, we have their behavior or appearance can be odd or unkempt, possibly wearing clothes that are out of fashion or mismatched, possibly a bit disheveled. Like, think of maybe like wearing a leisure suit or like a hat that really is not of the times. And it's interesting because I actually think of some of the Doctor Who characters, some of the different
Mm,
interpretations of the Doctor and their choice and style maybe might be in this more schizotypal domain. Hmm.
interesting. So, criterion 8 is lacking close relationships, same as schizoid, but theirs is due to uncomfortableness with people. And that kind of goes along with criterion 9, which is having high social anxiety related to paranoid fears. So, not like a negative self view, like avoidant. Now, time and familiarity does not help with their social anxiety.
Yeah. Yeah. So, like, are they talking about me? Can I trust them? That type of thought is pervasive. But again, like these other disorders that we've been talking about, it's not psychosis and it's not autism. We're going to go into the weeds more soon as our next series in the works is schizotypal. But for now, let's move on to schizophrenia.
So for schizophrenia, we're out of reality, like we're in psychosis land, as evidenced by both positive and negative symptoms, signaling that we've left the real world.
Yep. So there has to be a positive symptom of delusions, hallucinations, or disorganized speech. All right. So what do those look like? Delusions are believing non reality things. So if I were to proclaim that I'm the Messiah or I am God, that would be a delusion, right?
Mhm.
So then hallucinations are experiencing things through the senses that are like not based in reality. So common ones are like hearing things or seeing things that really aren't there. And then we have disorganized speech. So that is like frequent derailment or incoherence, almost like a word salad is what we think of. Like it's clear that we're not in reality. Okay. And then we have a second symptom, which could include grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior. This might look like inappropriate facial expressions or laughter or behavior that is really not consistent with the situation. Possibly they could be rigid or freeze or maybe doing repetitive movements over and over and over again. There can also be other negative symptoms. So, like diminished emotional expression, or what we call avolition, or a lack of goal directed behavior. So, you might even ask yourself, like, is anyone really there?
Now, these symptoms must cause impairment with continuous signs of disturbance for at least 6 months, but the symptoms have to occur for a significant amount of time within 1 month of that half year. It can't be part of any mood disorder like schizoaffective, depressive, or bipolar with psychotic features. It can't be due to substance or other medical stuff.
Mhm.
And now this is super interesting. So if there's a neurodevelopmental history like autism, the additional diagnosis of schizophrenia is made only if there's prominent delusions or hallucinations in addition to other required symptoms. Because basically that disorganized or repetitive speech cannot be the main criterion.
Right. Yes, because the symptoms have to demonstrate that they are out of reality. Yeah. All right, though. But how do these overlap?
Well, schizoid and schizotypal are both cluster A personality disorders involving social isolation, interpersonal issues, and restricted affectivity. They also have one criterion in the DSM that they share that's exactly the same. So they both lack close friends or confidants other than first degree relatives. And then in research, there's actually a lot of measurement that's stated to be on that schizoid schizotypal continuum.
Mm-hmm. Yep. All right. So now for the schizophrenia overlap. The DSM mentions schizotypal personality disorder in the schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders section. noting that it is considered part of the schizophrenia spectrum of disorders. And that's actually where the ICD 10 lists it as well. But the actual criteria of schizotypal are explained in the personality disorder section.
Then, schizoid can mimic negative symptoms of schizophrenia and thus, according to the PDM, is a subsyndromal schizophrenia spectrum disorder. So
Ooh,
subsyndromal, right? That's meaning it's like pre-psychotic. It's like underneath that threshold and it exists, but it's on like the cusp of psychotic symptoms. There's no
right.
psychosis.
Yes. Yeah. Subsyndromal. So pre psychotic, before psychosis. So this highlights the debate throughout the field of psychology about whether or not schizoid is on the schizophrenic spectrum or not. Some say yes, some say no.
Now, some researchers say that all three of these come from the same personality line, but this is debated.
Hmm.
And once again, I want to caveat that not all schizoid or schizotypal personalities are at the disorder level.
Yeah.
But anyway, let's look at how they differ.
Hmm. Yeah. So we'll start first with schizoid and schizotypal personality disorder. So the first thing that we'll look at is reality. So schizoid's reality testing is intact. The detachment into fantasy does not affect reality, versus schizotypal has cognitive and perceptual distortions and significant eccentricity or oddness. Like they toe that line of reality. They're not psychotic, though they flirt with that line an awful lot.
Now, interpersonally, schizoids are disinterested or detached in relationships and totally indifferent to praise or criticism, according to the DSM. They are also lower in hostility and aggressiveness. In contrast, schizotypals are super anxious and uncomfortable with relationships with some paranoid thinking. So it's hard for them to maintain relationships.
Then we look at emotions. So, unsurprisingly, schizoids lack affect or are detached from their emotions. Schizotypals have emotions that are restricted or possibly inappropriate. They are higher in anxiety and neuroticism. And then the next one that we look at is the self. So schizoids score low on self consciousness versus schizotypals score high on self consciousness.
And then regarding impairment, schizotypal can experience more impairment in functioning due to oddities and reality distortions, while schizoids can actually function reasonably well, but they're just isolated. Now, of course, it does depend on several factors.
But now let's look, though, at how schizophrenia is different from both schizoid and schizotypal personality disorder. So, some researchers say that schizoid is not on the schizophrenia spectrum, though, as we've discussed in this schizoid series, research does show a genetic link with schizoid personalities and relatives with schizophrenia.
So, spoiler alert, we think that schizoid is on the schizophrenia spectrum, just like the non psychotic end of that, and they just don't reach psychosis. And then, of course, as we've been saying, researchers don't really get schizoids, so it's no wonder that there's a debate.
Hmm. Yeah. So schizotypal personality disorder, as it flirts with psychosis, is widely accepted as being part of the schizophrenia spectrum. In fact, it's considered to be a milder version of schizophrenia by some. Now, the DSM schizophrenia differential diagnosis says schizotypal personality disorder can be distinguished from schizophrenia by symptoms below the psychotic threshold that are more so associated with persistent personality features. And interestingly, the DSM does not mention schizoid here.
Now, an overview schizophrenia has persistent psychotic symptoms. Schizotypal does not have persistent psychosis, though they toe the line. Schizoid does not even come close to the line. Maybe it like hides from it in its turtle shell.
Mm-hmm. All right. But in order to take this a level deeper, we need to introduce a new term. It's not a personality disorder and it's not in the DSM. But Doc Fish, we need to talk about the concept of schizotypy or schizotypy.
hmm Okay, so first I'm going to walk you through a model by Paul Meehl involving schizotypy before we even define all the terms. So first, you're born with DNA, right? This is called the schizogene, which interacts with other factors and leads to something called schizotaxia, or the potential for cognitive slippage in the brain. Okay. So schizo genes in the DNA result in the brain and neuronal structures being prepared to deteriorate out of reality. This is the foundation. Okay. And then all of this interacts with like external life experiences to result in a personality organization of schizotypy.
Ooh, so fascinating. Okay, so let me see if I can get this right. So, some people have DNA that results in a schizotaxic brain that is prone to slipping out of reality at a neuro level. And then you add in life and experiences, and then a schizotypy personality organization is formed. Is that right?
Hmm.
That is fascinating.
Yes. So schizotypy as a concept started in the early 1900s with Kraepelin and Bueller. However, research fell off until the early 1980s when it exploded again.
Hmm.
So, in the last couple decades, it's actually been one of the most active areas of research. So, for
Oh.
example, in 2014, there were 1,629 published reports that included schizotypal or schizotypy just in the title.
That is a lot of research. Wow. All right. But we need to define what schizotypy actually is.
Okay, so schizotypy is the unobservable latent construct that is essentially a liability for schizophrenia. It's a
Whoa.
personality organization. A person with schizotypy is a schizotype. So, similar to like a genetic phenotype or like someone who's brown eyed or blonde haired, a schizotype is a person with the genetic traits that predispose them to schizophrenia. Schizotypy is the personality organization stemming from that genetic makeup.
Oh, yes. So interesting. Okay. So here, I also think it's important to note that these terms don't necessarily map on nicely to the DSM's diagnoses, and schizotypy isn't a diagnosis. Some actually argue that the concept of schizotypy extends beyond what the DSM captures in terms of personality. And also important to note here is that schizotypes exist on a continuum. Like they can range from healthy all the way up to schizophrenia.
Right. And Meehl further argued that 10% of the general population is believed to be a schizotype,
Oh,
but not all of them show it. Like it can lie dormant, which Doc Bach and I believe that perhaps the dormant schizotype might be part of the schizoid personality.
ooh, the plot thickens. Okay, well, let's go a little bit deeper. Schizotypy stems from a genetic loading that's in the fabric of your DNA. Schizotypy is basically the pathway to psychosis. It's a necessary ingredient in the psychotic personality soup, if you will. While psychosis can mean schizophrenia, there are other psychotic disorders stemming from personality as well.
Yes, so this is where we see some schizotypic disorders that do map onto the DSM diagnoses. Okay, so namely schizotypal personality disorder and paranoid personality disorder. Both are on the cusp of reality and non reality, and they can fully disintegrate into schizophrenia and paraphrenia, respectively.
Uh-huh. And here we're going to add some more visuals to our blog. So if you're a visual learner, we'll link that in the show notes for you. All right. So as we discussed before, schizotypy develops from the potential to have cognitive slippage, also called schizotaxia. This is where, on a brain based level, the personality is more prone to decompensation, to melting, to disintegrating. And whether or not someone's personality actually does backslide is based on a number of factors, including genetic and environmental risks. All right, so let's look first at potential genetic risks. This includes other traits of social introversion, high neurosis, like nervous energy or high anxiety, aggression, and anhedonia. So, anhedonia is loss of pleasure in things, which can be a symptom of depression, but also it's a symptom of schizoid. Yeah. And then we have environmental. So, this is basically life. stressors, trauma. So, all of these things here influence whether a schizotype heads towards psychosis or not.
And I think here is a great place to address like a super insightful question and comment that we received about low birth weight and premature birth in relation to schizophrenia, schizotype, and schizoid. Most of the research addresses this from the perspective of a schizophrenic mother giving birth, and then also of risk factors for schizophrenia. Some also included schizotypal in there. This research is very much associated with complications or birth trauma in general, as well as lower birth weight, lower gestational age, and fetal growth. And it seems that more male babies are at risk.
Ooh, how fascinating. All right, so regarding those with schizoid personality disorder, one article noted that male children and teens with schizoid personality disorder had low body weight, right? And then another article noted of all the personality disorders, schizoids are the only ones more likely to be underweight and more so for schizoid women. And another interesting nugget, malnutrition in the first trimester increased the risk for schizoid personality disorder, according to another study. All right, one last one. Maternal stress, especially in the second trimester, childhood trauma, and cannabis use are linked to schizophrenia development.
So that said, even in the best environment, you cannot escape your genetically oriented schizotypy. It's
Right.
in your genes and you can't change it. But you can escape the manifestation of the schizotypy if it stays latent and dormant. But I'm not sure that this is necessarily a choice. It really depends on the cards you were dealt, genetic and environmental.
So the only thing between schizotypy and its manifestation are multiple genetic risk factors and stressors. So Meehl actually called these polygenetic potentiators. It's a fun word. So these polygenetic potentiators push the schizotype towards psychosis.
Yes, and we just talked about some of these. So, like introversion, anxiety proneness, aggression, and loss of pleasure.
Mhm. But it also doesn't mean that if you have birth trauma or life trauma and schizotypy that you're doomed to develop schizophrenia. Like people aren't machines, right? And there's no 2 + 2 = 4 equation for schizophrenia's development. But I do have a question. Doc Fish, where does this leave schizoids?
Okay, so here's our hypothesis about schizoids. So, we believe that the schizoids are on the same spectrum as schizotypal and schizophrenia, though they never reach psychosis. Why? Well, we think that schizoids, though they are schizotypes, in our opinion, their schizotypy lies dormant or unobservable, perhaps because of their low neuroticism and high detachment. So instead of splitting from reality completely, they adaptively find a way to split into fantasy, and it spares them from the observable problematic psychosis.
And I think this might explain why schizoids can feel like they are going mad or are crazy. But what
Mhm.
you're saying is that schizoids essentially jump off the inevitable train to near psychosis or psychosis land, or maybe maybe they hide in the luggage compartment or something, or or like maybe they hide like a
Yeah.
stowaway and don't get off at the schizotypal or the schizophrenic destinations. I don't
Yes, maybe. So their hiding and splitting off is adaptive and it saves them.
know.
And
Mhm.
most likely they found this adaptation earlier on in life because the longer you stay on the train when you have schizotypy, the more inevitable the cliff of reality becomes.
Uh-huh. Yes. This is so fascinating. But I do feel like we need to back this train up a bit and talk about the problems with definitions on schizotypy and also differing opinions. All right. So I'll start us off. This is going to come as a big surprise, but researchers are split. Of course they are, right? Do schizoids have schizotypy or not? Some say yes, Others say no. The PDM and McWilliams consider schizotypy to be a trait within the schizoid personality.
So, schizotypy as a concept has been approached by different theories and methodologies. So, there's like a lot of debate. And while we are currently using it in accordance with Meehl's model, sometimes it can also mean like schizophrenia like phenomenology that is stable and enduring, but not psychotic.
And I would actually argue that maybe that's the schizotypal camp, actually.
It might be. Now, again, some argue that schizoid is not schizophrenia related, so it's not an example of a schizotypic psychopathology. But some argue, get this, that schizoid and avoidant personality disorders could be in the realm of the schizotypic or schizophrenia spectrum pathology.
Okay. This is where we sit, actually. Like you
Mhm.
and I, Dogfish, we think that they're all on the same spectrum. Hmm.
So perhaps schizoid has much more of the negative traits of schizophrenia, and schizotypal has more of the positive traits of schizophrenia.
I think you're onto something here. Yeah. So the positive traits are potentially what take it over the edge into full blown psychosis. This is really, really fascinating to think about. So it just makes sense because the overlap is with the negative symptoms, right? Across the
Mhm.
whole spectrum. Schizoid, schizotypal, schizophrenia all have the negative symptoms in common. However, what you're saying is it's the positive symptoms that are more problematic. So let's remember positive symptoms are things like hallucinations and delusions. Those are more obviously pushing us outside of reality. I totally agree. I
Mhm.
think you're onto something here.
It's possible, just hypotheses. But that actually brings me to Ketty. So, Ketty actually found that while schizophrenia is genetic, it produces different phenotypes depending on social, emotional, environmental stuff. So, briefly, he proposed 4 variants of schizophrenia and he put them all on a spectrum. Okay. So the first one is chronic schizophrenia. This is similar to Kraepelin's dementia precox. It's also called true or process schizophrenia. And I think this one might be the closest to the DSM schizophrenia that we have now.
Yes, I've heard of that. Yeah. And then we also have the acute schizophrenic reaction, which is when schizophrenia is precipitated by external events or major traumas that lead to that rapid slippage into non reality. But interestingly, there's a good prognosis. So the psyche is able to spring back. Isn't that interesting? So
Mhm.
I'm thinking maybe this could describe other psychotic disorders, maybe like schizoaffective disorder or mood disorders with psychotic features.
Maybe.
Hmm.
So, number 3 is borderline schizophrenic, which maps onto the DSM schizotypal, where they're on the cusp of reality.
Yeah.
And then the
Hmm.
fourth one was termed inadequate personality and apparently is more similar to the DSM schizoid.
Aha. Huh.
So basically, we have all the schizo disorders that are somehow related, possibly, and like also very different. And there's still debate and the differing perspectives like don't match up, of course, right? So we have the
Yeah.
DSM, the ICD, psychodynamic, historical psychologists, and psychiatrists. They all give us data to work with, but there is no one conclusion.
Yeah. Of course. Of course. But let's bring this back around to schizotypy because I want to be really clear here about what it is not. So, schizotypy is not the same as the DSM schizotypal or schizotypal personality disorder. Schizotypy is a latent, unobservable construct, while schizotypal personality disorder is an observable personality presentation.
Schizotypy is not just for identifying DSM schizotypal personality disorder features or any DSM diagnosis. Like it is bigger than that.
Mhm.
And not all schizotypes are expected to develop schizophrenia. There is a range from healthy to psychotic. So some will show schizophrenia, some will show like non psychotic features, schizotypal personality disorder, maybe.
Yeah.
Some will be quietly schizotypic, which we think is possibly the schizoid personality.
Mm-hmm.
So schizotypes exist on a continuum, and there is a range of healthy presentations all the way to schizophrenia.
Yes, yes. And then we don't really know what causes someone to flirt with psychosis or go into psychosis, but research tells us that it is a complex interplay between the schizotypy, other genes, and environment or experiences. And I will say too, putting in a plug here, if you found schizotypy fascinating, we did too. And we're actually going to unpack it more in this schizotypal personality series. But for today, it is time to land the plane. So we unpacked schizoid versus schizotypal versus schizophrenia, which required us to bring in that fascinating concept of schizotypy. So while it is widely recognized that schizotypal and schizophrenia exist on the same continuum, being close to psychosis and in psychosis, respectively, schizoids have befuddled scientists. Doc Fish and I believe schizoids are all part of the same schizophrenia spectrum, though they never reach psychosis. In fact, they use their split into fantasy in an adaptive way, in our opinion. While some researchers argue that the schizotype isn't part of schizoid, we actually believe it is, and that the schizotype lies dormant, keeping the schizoid away from psychosis. But on that note, that's a wrap for today. Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Personality Couch. Make sure to check out our blogs that coincide with these episodes at www.personalitycouch.com. And as always, don't forget to give us a thumbs up or rate and review us on your favorite podcast app. And on YouTube, hit that bell so you don't miss a single episode in our Schizotypal series. Be well, be kind, and we'll see you next time on The Personality Couch. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute a professional relationship. If you're in need of professional help, please seek out appropriate resources in your area. Information about clinical trends or diagnoses are discussed in broad and universal terms and do not refer to any specific person or case.